space is a place for us.
Real people with real issues.
Discussing real topics.
Black Space.
A safe space for our community.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Black Space Live. I'm your host, the Finley. Today, we're going to talk about the Black church and how it has benefited the Black community. But I'm not here alone. Today, joining me in this conversation are two amazing, intelligent gentlemen. In no particular order, we have Daniel Williams. He's the Director of Business Development for Legacy Consulting Solutions, New York bred, residing in sunny South Florida. He's another Floridian. Good evening, Daniel.
Yes, sir.
Also with me is a regular guest. You got no stranger to you guys, definitely no stranger to me, Mr. George Middleton of Indianapolis. He's a mental health counselor and author of Black, which stands for Beliefs Limiting the Authentic Cultural Knowledge, which is also available on Amazon. I invite you guys to pick that up. Good evening, George.
Good evening, Penny.
We're going to talk about joining us a little bit later is Karanji Kadima. I'll introduce him as soon as he joins us. But we're going to get right to it, fellas. The Black, two topics that are very, very, very difficult to talk about. They say you don't talk religion and politics. Well, I've had the opportunity to talk religion already, or politics rather. We're going to talk a little religion. And I will admit I have a little bias in this conversation. I am a devout Christian pretty much my entire life, with the exception of that woke period during college. But I won't really get into that. But in any event, we're going to talk about a very crazy topic, or a divisive topic, is, especially in the Black community, the Black church. Whether we're talking about, the conversation about, the quote unquote white Jesus, or, the white man religion, or the prosperity gospel. Those are many things that many people talk about negatively about the Black church. But the Black church has played a positive role in the Black community, dating way back to slavery, very instrumental in helping abolition, the very small Black church back then. And of course, we all know the very famous role it played in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. But the conversation is, let's talk about the current role, both positive and negative. And let's be open, let's be honest. I'm going to kick it off with you, George. I'll let you start this conversation. How do you feel currently? First of all, what do you think the current state of the Black church is currently?
Well, I always like to start off with the positive like to start off with the strengths before I start evaluating the weaknesses. So I would much rather first acknowledge what the Black church has done and what it does continue to do before we get into the current state of affairs of the Black church. Is it okay to do it that way?
Go ahead. Floor's yours.
Okay. So I see three areas where the Black church was directly a direct major resource, our go-to resource in our development. And the first of it was when we were initially brought over here as slaves. Before we could even read, before we even understood the language of the European. We had our own language, we had our own way of worship. We were innately spiritual. So at that point, obviously, we depended on our spiritual belief to get through all of the trauma that was inflicted on our ancestors coming across the water. Then, after we were allowed to learn how to read and learn how to read the King James version of the Bible, we then adopted that form of religion, and we used it. We've used it to its max, and it helped us get through abolishment when slavery was abolished. And we try to go out and figure out how do we move forward as a community as quote unquote free men. And then further into our development, the church was definitely integral in civil rights. I mean, most of our leaders were right out of the church in addressing civil rights. So in that way, the Black church has been key in those early developmental phases of our history with this country. Now, in terms of its current state, I think we're at a fork in the road because we're using age-old techniques for a brand new environment. The stuff that we're doing now, most of the Black churches, one of my roles is I serve as minister of music. I'm a musician, and I've worked in the church arena for quite a lengthy period of time. And what I can tell, with the exception of a few mega churches and other, healthy churches, the majority of our churches, the state they're in, they find themselves in, is a lack of legacy. The average Black church is attritioning out. It's dying out. The giving that most churches depend on is slowly attritioning off, and they have not made an official transfer of leadership to the newer generation.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
No.
So that's our current state, because we have a lot of the old dogs, so to speak, still out there fighting, trying to push. But the generation they're trying to reach is not really hearing them right now.
As we transition, it seems that Karanji is about to join us. Having some technical. Oh, there he is. Karanji, good evening.
In the building.
Hey, man, how you doing? How you doing?
What's going on, brother?
Just a quick introduction. Joining us is Karanji Kaduma. Is it Kaduma?
Yes, Karanji Kaduma.
Karanji Kaduma. He's a high school teacher at River Rouge High in Detroit, Michigan, in the D. He's owner of Soul Capital 313 brand and band leader of Karanji's Soul Water. He's also a self-proclaimed unapologetic lover of the people. Should be a good conversation for you, Daniel.
Yes, sir.
Pros and cons of Black church currently.
All right. I'm not going to be as diplomatic, so I'm gonna just go right into the cons.
Get into it.
I actually think that as an institution, the role of the Black church has actually, the Black church has abdicated its responsibility to the community, by and large. Now, there are going to be some people that'll hop in the comments and they're going to say that they will point out to the one-offs. But what I like to do is I don't like to argue individual attainment. I like to drive through neighborhoods, our neighborhoods that have significant churches, church presence. And I don't like to do it on Sundays because they're always open on Sundays. I like to do it on Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, those days of the week, and see what role they play in bettering their communities. And for me, a majority of them have actually abdicated that responsibility. There was a point where the church was a source of assistance and actually benefited the people for the community, and in a lot of ways, they've gotten away from that mission. And there are a lot of things I can say about that side of it, but I'm not going to touch too much on that now. We'll kind of get into that as we go a little bit deeper. Speaking to what the brother Georgia just said about the attrition, it's a conversation I had recently with a pastor friend of my dad's, about the fact that a lot of the older generation refused to train up their replacements. And this is actually, for me, one of the significant criticisms that I had about the civil rights movement as well, where the same people that led the civil rights movement that were in their 20s when they led it are still the people that are in front of the microphones in 2019, well, those that are left over when things happen. And there's that tug between the old generation wanting to keep that power and not passing those lessons on to the younger generation and taking advantage of the energy of the younger generation. And that same issue is we largely see in the church environment, which has led to a lot of the attrition. But just staying away from the theology, I just feel that the Black church is actually probably best if it goes extinct. It's about time for it to go extinct, and it's about time for a community-focused organization to take its place.
I am wounded by that.
It's all right.
I
Just so you
respect.
know.
I definitely
Just so
respect
you
your
know.
opinion. I just
Context.
want to say that without getting, I don't want to go too deep just yet because I want to get Brother Karanji's opinion on his pros and cons. But I will say that just kind of peeking into the next phase of this conversation, that the church is a microcosm of the community at large. But Brother Karanji, pros and cons of the current Black church.
Okay. Let me go with the pros first. The pros are that historically it was a bastion of comfort for our people in times of need. It was a major part of the Underground Railroad in the late 50s. Actually, before then, when we had when you had much more radical examples of Christians, like you had the Deacons of Defense and those type of individuals who really were truly revolutionary, and revolutionary individuals who were willing to arm our people to defend our people against white supremacy and racism and oppression and basically terrorism from white people at that time. They were much more relevant. They also were also relevant as far as promoting Black businesses. They supported Black businesses. A lot of that money came back into the community. There was not this thing of really profiting from the community that you see today. I'm sure there were pastors that made good money back in that day as well, but that was it was not the main things. So those are the pros. I would also say that, there were a lot of community things that churches did as far as providing things for youth at one point. They had the church leagues, and, a lot of things like that. So I try to be balanced and not say that there's all negative. But overwhelmingly, I'm a science teacher. I'm a science person. And so I look at the overall progress of any institution in the Black community versus how much it has taken in versus how much it has given. And if we were to go from the 1970s on to now, it has taken way more than it has given. And it says since 1980 that the church has taken in $420 billion. There's no other institution in the Black community that has taken in that amount of money with such a small amount of return. So to me, that is the crux of one of the main issues I have with the cons. Also, the idea that the church has also been one of the few institutions that we feel that most Black people have been very resistant to being critical of or holding accountable. We hold our schools accountable. We hold our businesses accountable. Yeah, we do. Cause if we have a bad school, we take our kids out of the school. We ain't going to that school in that neighborhood, in that hood. I'm taking my kid out of here. They going to school over here. So we take our kids out of those schools. We won't be. You have far more parents going to church, getting involved in church than they do in the schools. I'm a teacher. I had parent-teacher conference this past week. I had maybe 10 parents. Okay, just to give you an example of the accountability just to get a real example. But I promise you, you go to church, I might have 100 parents. So I guarantee you it's far higher percentage of parents going to church than coming to parent-teacher conference. So that's just one example. To defend my cons. Also, it is like the brother said, Daniel said below, the church is no longer relevant to the Black community at the level it was once. It is on its way out. I do believe there's several institutions I think is on the way out that we are very, very resistant of acknowledging. The reason why I say that is because you look at how you just determine if an institution is relevant or not. You look at how it affects those that are most disenfranchised, and you look at the young people. And today, the young people are the most disenfranchised to church that they ever did been in the history of our people. They are now moving more towards indigenous African spiritual belief systems. That seems to be the major.
I don't want to get too deep into the woods on that conversation. I want to stick to the pros and the cons, and I want to hit on something that Brother Daniel said. And I listen. devout member of the church, and I understand that when people say involved, I think that people misconstrue or don't understand what involvement really is. When a parent drops their kid off at school, I akin that to people coming to church on Sunday. If the church has 1,000 members, probably less than 100 of them are actually involved. And when I say involved, involvement in the church is involvement outside of those four walls. Most church members aren't. Most church members are comfortable paying their tithes and leaving. And believe it or not, there have been many polls taken of the amount of people that actually pay tithes. It's a very small percentage. I know that the church takes in a lot of money. I know a lot of people focus a lot on the money they take in, but most members of the church aren't even involved doing anything outside of the church. And so that's why I'm cautious when I have that conversation. When you, as a teacher, certainly you know that there are very few parents that are involved. Percentage-wise, that's about the same in the church. And so that's one of the reasons. That's why I made the comment earlier that the church is a microcosm of the African-American community as a whole. And when people talk about accountability, again, we don't hold, I agree, we do hold schools accountable in terms of we'll take our kids out of a bad school, but churches aren't much different. People will stay at a church, but leave when when churches try to hold them accountable for certain things. So that's a conversation I do want to kind of dig into. George, George.
Yes, sir.
The conversation is always people always talk about the money that churches take in and how there's little giving back. Do you think there's a difference between the Black church and any other entity in the Black community? Because I believe that a lot of entities take money from the Black community and don't give anything back.
When I heard that comment, I think it's a very accurate comment and relevant comment. It reminded me of a comment by Dr. Umar Johnson, who notes that the Black community makes the church its center of operations. The white community, however, makes banks their center of operations. And so they get a lot more, if you want to be of service to anybody, and churches are a service institution, you can't service without a strong economic platform. So I would submit that banks can be your most spiritual resource that you can use. So they get a lot more in the work of doing your ministry. And so what happens is in the white community, they have as many churches as well. However, because they make banks the center of their community, they can go to their banks for every developmental phase of life needs that they have. Where the Black community, we put all our money and resources into our churches. And on Sundays, the churches are like holding just enormous amounts of money that they then turn around and deposit into banking institutions that do not represent us. So we're not being spiritually sound with our use of the money. We're not being supportive of our community with our use of the money. And we're not being stewards of our resources by taking money out of our community and putting it into a system that is statistically known for discriminating against us or charging us higher rates for the same level of service, if not just denying us altogether. So that's where we're making a strategic error. We're playing this moralistic game against the community that's playing an economic game. And no matter how you look at it, as spiritual as you want to be, and I said this on a previous podcast, you can only be as spiritual as you can afford to be.
And I promise you guys, this was not planned by me.
Who is that lovely lady?
This is amazing Ivo. She's the other host on here on Black Space. She's also an ordained minister. And I say that I kind of preference the conversation by letting them know I'm kind of biased today. I kind of came wearing my bias. kind of came where my bias. And so I know that all of a sudden this ordained minister kind of jumps on into the conversation as I call them backups. I will make a quick joke. It was divine intervention, y'all. It was divine. I didn't plan it. God planned that. But Ivo, we're having a conversation, and I don't know where you picked up on the conversation, but some comments were made about, obviously, actually, Brother Karate said the Black church is on its way to extinction. So did Brother Daniel.
That was me. That was,
sorry, Brother Daniel said the Black church is on its way to extinction. I think Brother Karate, you agree with that notion. Ivo, we were talking about the pros and cons of the Black church, the current Black church. As an ordained minister, and I made the points that that the Black church is a microcosm of the Black community as a whole, and I think that a lot of folks overestimate what goes on in Black churches, and they underestimate what takes place. And so, as an ordained minister, you can certainly give us more insight on that.
I agree wholeheartedly with your point, Penny. It is definitely a microcosm of the Black community. And I find it interesting that a panel of Black men discussing Black church are talking about accountability without talking about the absence of Black men, because the lack of accountability that does exist exists because y'all not there. We are holding it down by ourselves almost as women, and there's only so much we can do. It's extremely difficult to police the behavior of men. As an ordained minister and an elder in the church, it was interesting maneuvering through some of the authoritative issues, because some men don't have a problem with women in leadership, and many men do because of underdeveloped egos and what have you. So I could not effectively do my job at the last church that I attended because of issues with female leadership. So when we do try to hold people accountable, we often go unheard. Women are often the victims of the things that people need to be held accountable for, but there's no men to help. There are very few, and the ones who are there aren't always alpha males or strong types who are willing to challenge authority when something is amok or something goes awry. So how do you feel, those of you who believe that the Black church needs to be extinct, how do you feel about Black men returning to possibly salvage the situation, just like in every other aspect of the Black community?
Daniel, you made the extension comment. Go ahead, respond.
All right. I wholeheartedly disagree, and here's why. And I'll give my context. I grew up in the Black church. My father is an ordained pastor in the Black church. I've been overseas as a missionary with the Black church. I went to a Black UNCF HBCU for college, right? So my experience isn't one from somebody who's been on the outside this whole time throwing stones. What it has come from is, when I look at Black Christianity, too often, and I'm going to speak to the point about the men, the presence of the men, but too often we've always approached it from the standpoint of being Christians first. And we don't have that luxury of being Christians first when we're treated as Black first by society. And I see that, but what I'm not talking about qualitative, I'm talking about quantitative. When we look at the numbers, what do the numbers say about where we stand in society? And so here's what we tend to do. We tend to say that the Black church has been the reason that we've had all this progress. And what we do is we measure our progress based on where we were previously. But we never measure our progress against white Christians, right? So I always have a problem because I measure the gap. I don't measure how far we've come. I measure the gap from dominant society. But that's a theology issue.
That's a 400-year gap. Like, we started out, we're here in America starting with negative wealth, negative everything. So in closing the gap, like, how?
But we've been Christians the whole time, right? So when you speak about a 400-year gap, but we were Christians in 1620 when we first came over here.
But you seem to be conflating issues here. Like, the gap that you're talking about I hear what I'm hearing, and I could have it wrong, so I want to clarify and make sure that I'm getting you right. What I'm hearing when you're talking about measuring the gap, it sounds like you're measuring things that are more societal than spiritual or religious, like white churches' ability to do missions and other things because they have wealth to do it, which has nothing to do with their Christianity. That's a societal issue. With Black people starting with negative wealth in our society, we're not going to be able to fund the same things as white churches. So if you're measuring the gap in that context, then I don't see how that's a fair measurement. If you want to measure it in terms of spirituality and Christ-likeness, then we're certainly doing way better than white church. Like,
may I interject between you two real quick?
I just want to clarify my point. I don't want to make this about Christian beliefs in spirituality versus Christian beliefs in spirituality. The discussion is, has the Black church benefited the Black community? So I'm looking at it quantifiably, not qualifiably.
Quantifying with what criteria? Is this just economic or is it spiritual?
So I'd like to interject. With that.
Go ahead, George.
You both for a minute. Okay. Ivo and Daniel, you're both right. You're both right. It may sound like you're arguing on two different sides of the coin, but both of your perspectives are correct. What needs to be addressed, though, is the why behind what you're observing. There's a reason why you have such a dearth of strong Black male figures in the system of the Black church as it stands today. And we don't address that. And Daniel starts to hit on that with his very powerful observation of, it's hard to be spiritual when you're treated as Black first. And that's a very powerful statement, because as men, first of all, Ivo, when you said a panel of Black men, I know I'm going to sound weird or crazy compared to everybody, but I no longer identify by a color, because that color has a set of beliefs associated that are responsible for the statement that Daniel made, when you're treated as Black first. And I find that anything that we try to organize and we put a color to it, it ends up being lower. It never quite hits the visionary mark we think we're doing. Consciously, we put that name there because we want to uplift ourselves. We want to show that we are somebody. We want to prove to the opposite side of the color coin that we are just as good. But oftentimes, the outcomes make liars out of us. So I'm submitting to you all in this conversation that the first layer of obstacles that's holding or smothering our effectiveness spiritually is this term of racial label Black, because we have internalized on a subconscious basis what Black is, and we often sabotage ourselves without even realizing it. And when we talk about trying to be a man and put Black in front of it, what we're doing is we are taking a role, a hierarchical role in the race construct that is lower than any other man. And even in our minds, we may not consciously believe that, but if you look at our statistical outcomes, the proof is in the pudding. We are performing at a lower level of effectiveness compared to our other racial and cultural groups. Now, I know it sounds crazy. I know it sounds way out of the way, but the more we keep hanging on to color and making color be our mantra, the more we'll keep repeating the same dynamic.
I will say this. Go ahead, Karanji.
I've been listening for a while. And George, that's a very interesting statement you had about the, everybody's made some very interesting statements. And I would say if we do not, I would probably ask you, off what category would you choose for us to unite as a people? Some people would say African American. Some would say, my father was a black nationalist, Republican of Africa. You have Garveyites who, black man rise up. First of all, I do believe that there's nothing wrong with us being proud of our melanated skin and the beauty that comes with that. Now, is that the limitation of who we are? Of course not. Because what happens is if you try to totally take away black or totally take away any of our ancestral connection, then that just makes us totally assimilated people with no connection to any type of cultural history or ancestry at all. So we have to be very careful with that. So I'm not sure. I'm not gonna make an assumption of what you conclude as our what you would use for our unification as a people, because there has to be something we hold on to. There has to be something to hold on to. Black was something. One time we were Negro, we were colored, we were nigger, all that. So we progressed to certain. Now they say we're African American. So what's the next level? Now, when it comes to the sister said before about the black man in the church, I think what she said has some truth to it. I'm not a Christian at all, but I think if you look at the reasons as to why the black man is not in the church, you have to go back to when the black man was into the church. And one of the most powerful movements ever by our people historically was the Garvey movement, which was actually a quote unquote Christian-centered movement. However, most of the focus was not on the religion. Most of the time when they had church, quote unquote, it was about talking about economics. So what was the result of that? The result of that was it was the largest movement ever known to the history of people of African descent in this country ever. Because Marcus Garvey decided that we're going to have our own levels of distribution, manufacturing, everything. Everything was ours. And the interesting part was he actually was successful at motivating and joining together the most impoverished groups of us, the most disenfranchised of us. And he did not do it from the standpoint of just come listen to me and maybe one day you'll die and go to heaven. That wasn't that. Which I hate. The reality is, go back to the main reality is, most pastors today and most churches today are not relevant to the black man. So until we acknowledge that fact, so as a teacher, if my students are not motivated to learn in my class, I have to look at what am I doing wrong as far as structurally, and as far as what am I doing wrong as far as my lesson. So the church today is not relevant to the black man. That's why you see.
I want to pause you there.
Let me finish the statement. And I'm not saying it from an emotional standpoint. We can look at statistics. Like the sister said. Let me finish what I'm saying. And I'm not an emotional speaker. I speak strictly on data. If you look at the data, black women greatly outnumber us in the church, but it wasn't always like that. So my issue is if you want to improve or increase the level of relevance of both, not just men, but young people are also leaving in droves as well from churches. You have to make it relevant to both of those populations. And first of all, the church is a quote unquote come to Jesus moment to acknowledge. First of all, last statement. Last statement. It needs to acknowledge that there is not relevant as it should be. If it's not humble enough to acknowledge itself and its flaws, like any person, like a person, if you can't acknowledge your flaws, you will not grow. You will not progress. You will die. So that's
a couple of points.
Kenny, before you do that, he asked a really important question that I just want to put out there. At the very first part, he said, if not black, then what do we find to unify on? And I just want to put that in there for everybody's submission is that first, before we can even agree what to unify on, that we have to at least come to a decision as to whether is the label black unifying enough? Is that really working for us right now? Because if we still believe that black is working for us, then we'll never be able to move to the next step in our evolution of unification.
And that's that. A couple points I want to hit on. The first point is a point that you've made several times, George, is that when you lead with Black, that in and of itself becomes a vision. The church, the capital C church,
Well, I
Christian.
can't hear you. Somebody else, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
the-
Someone's coming in to interrupting you what you were saying. Go ahead, though.
the capital C church Christian has always been a moral leader. I think a lot of people's issue with the Christian church circles around economics.
Yes.
But the capital C church has led on morality. They pleaded with the United States government during the civil rights movement on it for moral reasons. It wasn't
Which
just
church?
It was the Black church. They led.
See, I'm going to have to just interrupt if I want to talk. I want to support what you're saying, Penny, and offer perspective that has not yet come up. I watch a lot of behavioral scientists on YouTube, listen to them while I work. I read books by behavioral scientists because that's just my jam. And so it's interesting how white people reverse engineer what Black people and spiritual people, especially spiritual melanated people, have always known, because white folks just have to do things the way white folks have to do things. So even when they're religious, they'll reverse engineer stuff and come to the same conclusions. And now what I'm seeing trending in these presentations about wealth creation and personal development is that everything comes from you becoming the highest version of yourself. The money, the influence. I'm talking about people, these white folks with money and influence that we're talking about. When they come together and talk and have their little conferences, what they conclude is, and what they pay thousands of dollars for other white people to tell them, is that all of the success comes from becoming the highest version of yourself, from confidence, from ethics, all the stuff that we've been talking about in church, especially Black church, the entire time. The problem is these people take that very seriously and they do the work. We do not yet have a culture that honors hard work because of our unique circumstance. Anytime we worked hard, we were punished. There were punitive damage, there were consequences, often punitive. And our existence in this country was for the purpose of labor. And we were supposed to remain a permanent labor class, even after the institution of slavery was diminished. I mean, it's not eradicated. We still have the prison system.
Rebranded.
So, yeah, thank you, rebranded. So, with that being said, we're at a deficit in our perspective on work and wanting to do the work. And then we have an absence of Black males in the community with strong work ethic. So we go to church and hear the same things, but don't always know how to put it into action because our ethics are not practical. But that's more of a Black people thing and not a Black church thing because of our unique situation. Our ethics are not practical because we've never been in situations where we could get practical results directly like anyone else. Hard work plus unity equals positive results. We've been sabotaged at every step of the journey. So the idea that becoming the highest version of yourself is the beginning of all success, including financial and economic success, we've been saying that the whole time, but people aren't doing it. And I don't mean to bring gender into it or make it a gender thing, but I put this back on the Black male leadership in the church because leadership really happens by example. If Black male leadership was still there, and if the Black male leadership that is there would do what they're preaching to us, I think we would all come up and the Black church could again be the epicenter of economic growth. But we don't know what works economically across the board. Like Black people don't know how to get the money in general. So how would the Black church know? Like,
you're making a really solid set of points. I just want to insert in there a label for what you're talking about, and I'm always coming from a therapeutic perspective. Those behaviors, that lack of accomplishment or lack of work ethic that you're referring to, that comes under the clinical label of learned helplessness, and that's a real psychological diagnosis. And learned helplessness can happen to any species, any living species. And as human beings, we are a species. We're not a race, we're a species. But we happen to be a species playing a race ideology game. And in the race ideology game, we always lose. And so when you work and you don't get that benefit for work and you give 150% and you only come up with 25% worth of effort, of outcome, over time, you just start resigning yourself to the fact that no matter how hard I work, it doesn't matter. And that becomes passed down generationally. And so you have a couple of generations of failure, of a try and fail, try and fail. The next generation, they just learn from that without you even officially or consciously teaching them. They just see that, hey, he doesn't even try. Daddy don't even try anymore. And again, I say that those things that you're talking about, which are very true, are directly affected or directly connected to this label of Black. Because when you take on an identity of Black, you're taking on struggle. You're taking on a history of pain and trauma and torture. That's not an empowering perspective to fight from. Because when you say I'm Black, you're automatically engendering a white response. Whenever you make something Black, the white response is, well, because they don't lead by white, they don't lead by color, because they don't have to. Their system supports them. So, but because they're doing it unconsciously, when you lead by color, they want to respond to that, because that's what race ideology does. It makes you have to fight somebody. So when people start talking about diversity, racial harmony, racial unity, they're talking apples and oranges, because the two do not mix. Race was not intended for harmony. Race was not intended for people to be equal. Race was never intended for Blacks to be over whites. We didn't create that. The European created that. And what we keep trying to do is improve our situation under a white or European ideology. When we get rid of this subconscious beliefs associated with Black, we can then tune into who we really are and become the men and the women we're supposed to be. But right now, as long as we keep leading with color, we're going to get the same outcomes. And I would say that history is supporting my perspective.
Really quick, before you
go ahead.
Comment, I want to ask two quick questions. I want to go to the questions from the group. The first question is, when we started the conversation before things really got hot and we got deep into the woods, Ivo and Daniel, you guys were making two great points from a different perspective. And so I asked this question of the group: what role, because we're certainly the question of the day that we're discussing is the role of the Black church and the Black community. What role do people want the Black church to have? And I asked that question is you want the church to have a moral role in the community or economic one? And I asked that question because when we see Black churches thrive, for every example of a church that's not, that's quote unquote failing the Black community, I can give you an example of a Black church that economically is doing very well in a Black community. You get wealthy pastors, you then in turn get wealthy members. It exists, those things exist. And those churches
it's not a one-to-one.
Wait. On the flip side, when the churches take a moral position, they are also criticized for standing on their morals. We see this in the example of Detroit, where the Winans, when he refused to bless the baby in front of the church because the mother was unwed, because that's how the church did it. He still blessed the baby, but he did it in private, as to not. And so it's like a lose-lose with the Black church. Dan, you're chomping at the bit.
So part of what you said, the part that I just wanted to make clarity on is, I never said that there are no churches doing good work. What I am saying is that if I were to drive through right now, tonight is a Thursday night, if I were to have driven through a Black neighborhood this evening that has 4 or 5 churches down one street, 3 or 4 of them are going to be closed right now. So, what is the role of the Black church that I would like to see the Black church be a part of? I would like to see them involved in community building, right? Earlier today, I went to an event that was after school provider program practitioners. So people that provide after school programs to keep kids engaged in different things. And one of the statistics jumped out to me. It said 2 to 6 o'clock in the afternoon is the highest rate for juvenile crime and delinquency, right? So that's when kids bored get into a lot of trouble. And I remembered I'd actually proposed a program for a church that would provide tutoring and some kind of a mentoring for kids in the church. And the question and the pushback I got was, what if they come and they break stuff? And so it's that mentality. And this is not a one-off situation. This happened multiple times. So I just left the church and started working with community organizations. So to Ivo's point, the issue is not that they're not Black men doing great work in the community. It's that they've decided to stop fighting against an institution that is very hesitant to change and adapt, and they're doing the work with community-based organizations. I've worked with
That's not a reflection of the Black church at large at all, though.
Pardon me?
That's not a reflection of the Black church at large at all.
That is a reflection of the Black church at large, because if it were not,
for example,
sure,
because we can really divvy this up into two groups: poor Black churches and the wealthy ones.
Let's do it.
Because there's not a whole lot of in between, and I've been members of both. The church that I was a member of in Detroit before I moved to Grand Rapids, my last church membership was Greater Grace Temple of the Apostolic Faith. You may be familiar with Bishop Ellis. That church, it's the largest church in the city of Detroit, so Rosa Parks' funeral and Aretha Franklin's funerals were both there. Greater Grace was my church home. Bishop Ellis married me. That's one of those, and it's a smaller mega church, but it does qualify as a mega church. And Bishop Ellis catches all the hell because people assume what he does and does not do, how much money he takes, how he's not pastoring the people, and the experience is actually totally different. They give a lot back to the community financially. They build a lot. They have a credit union, a funeral home. Like they're building their side of Detroit, and they have been longer than I've been alive. So that's one example of a very wealthy church that's doing a lot. But if you ask the people of Detroit, well, what is Greater Grace doing? If you're not affiliated with Greater Grace Temple or you don't know anything about it, the knee-jerk reaction is, they ain't doing enough. Bishop Ellis, he's just on TV, living good, without knowing how much money they're actually pumping back into Detroit. Now, on the flip side, poorer churches, like the one I just served at for 13 years, want all these kinds of programs, but these churches are reflections of the communities that they're in. We didn't have no money. And so if the community does not support the church, how can the church support the community? Because most churches are funded by the people. My goal personally in ministry is to get to such a point where I can fund churches completely out of my own pocket so that people don't have to be worried about things like that. I'm not one who, I don't believe that tithes are a New Testament command. So if people are really expected to give out of the spirit of liberty in what they have, then churches need funding beyond what the communities can provide, because the communities can't always provide, or the membership rather. But if the community would support the church could support the community more when you're talking about these smaller churches. Now, what you're talking about, I think I know that group in the middle that's kind of bougie, not totally wealthy, not totally poor, and not wanting to break anything. But I think they're the minority of Black churches.
Well, let me,
Roger, go ahead.
I live in Detroit. I live very close to Greater Grace Temple. Very, within 5-minute drive.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not overly impressed by Greater Grace Temple. I've known about the church for many years. I'm not sure if Daniel was online when on the coldest day in winter when I went to all the mega churches in Detroit. It was the coldest day. It was -10 degrees. I stopped by Triumph Church. I stopped by I stopped by New Ebenezer. I stopped by Greater Grace. I stopped by all these churches. Every single one of them were closed. There was no warming centers. There was cold and it was dark. And these buildings had heat coming out of the chimney. So for me, I'm about the people. All that fluffy stuff, and no, if you're not providing for the needs of the people who are most hurt by, who are most vulnerable, then to me you are irrelevant to me as an institution of the people. I mean, in when it comes to being a spiritual bastion, because I know we talk about. I mean, I'm not religious, but I've studied Jesus. I just don't think Jesus will have a church clothes on -10-degree day. I don't see that happening. I just don't sound like something. I mean, it's
But to throw the
really,
baby out with the bathwater and then accuse them of not doing anything is also not fair.
Let me finish what I'm saying. And so when I see those type of things, and I've seen it numerous times, I think one of the things that I've repeated before, and I think people who are in church are very hesitant to do, and I think that's one of the biggest weaknesses of our people in particular, is we don't, okay, you can mention the good things. There are some great, I mentioned when I first came on, before you came on, I mentioned the good things in the church. However, the issue with people in church, they aren't able to be very honest about where the church is failing. That is a flaw. It's almost like a relationship with somebody. You're married to this person, they got issues, but you want to ignore their issues because they look good on the outside. No.
That's not entirely true. I partially agree.
That is not how we work. That is not how we.
Black people have a welfare mentality when it comes to.
Listen. Let me listen. So, in order for true progress to be made, from a very, very logical, real standpoint, we have to acknowledge the flaws of the church in order for it to grow. And that's where it starts from.
The function of the church before we can acknowledge the flaws. Because if you agree on what the church should be doing, so how can we agree on what they're not doing?
Well, you can. That's. I mean, it's been around for too long to not know what it should be doing. This should be. I mean, that's like.
No, that's not true. You can't dictate as an outsider what a religious institution should be doing. That's not a true statement.
That's
part of the community.
You dictate what a religious institution should be doing when you don't practice the religion.
That's what I agree with
Ivo on that.
I'm working in school, and because you don't go, just because your child is attending school or you don't have a work there, that you can't say anything about the institution of education.
Apples to apples, honey. That's not apples to apples.
That's
Apples to apples. I come out the church, and I was everything that Karanji's talking about are things that I proposed while I was still a member. So I don't want to just bring criticisms. What are some of the things that we could do as the church could do as an organization? They're very simple, small things.
But what is the church supposed to do? I think we have to establish that first, so then we can criticize what they're not doing. Because I'm for the criticism.
Let me answer that.
Establish what their role actually is, then we can criticize.
Let me answer that from the Bible. Sermon on the Mount. Before Jesus ministered to the people, Jesus fed the people. The role of the church is to meet the people at their needs. So if the people are hungry, if the people are cold, if the people are without clothes.
Where Peter said, "Silver and gold have I none," because I've been in churches where silver and gold they didn't have.
But isn't the church is the church not the one speaking that if you believe and have faith, then he shall provide the cattle on 1,000 hills?
The richer churches were supposed to support the poorer churches because some churches are going to be poor. The Bible said that too.
I just want
I don't want listen.
We're moving.
I don't want to listen. We're moving. Pause for a second. I don't want to get too deep. Listen, we're having a.
The role of the church is to provide for the needs of the community.
And the church as well, because some churches have more money than other churches, and all churches cannot provide for physical needs like that, and that's in the Bible too.
Forgetting that the church is not the building. We keep thinking
the
church has never been the building.
We need a Bible study.
But listen, you guys, we're gonna
go to the Bible, but it won't actually support the points that you are making. Those are traditional arguments that actually not found in the Bible.
I'll send you the references. DM me.
Not found in the
Listen,
book.
I don't want to listen. Daniel, Ivo, listen. We're getting. I
Religion does
appreciate
that.
but we're kind of going back and forth in the statement I made earlier. First of all, we need to define what the role is what the role even is of the Black
Provide
church.
for the needs of the people.
A couple of issues that I have, and a couple of issues I have with a lot of people in their criticism of the Black church is that there's two different viewpoints. One is the viewpoint of the people that aren't even church members or believers trying to tell a religious institution or faith-based institution what they should believe and how they should believe it. That's number one. Number two, a lot of people that have left the church, listen, you left your church because your church was not providing what it needed for you. You didn't find another church that was meeting that need. And that's another issue that we have. And then like a scorned divorcee, marriage is bad. So all churches are now bad. And I hate that. I hate that. Ivo brings up a good point. Wait a minute, Daniel. Ivo brings up a good point.
Sure.
You could draw churches do that. You need money to do things.
True.
And all the scripture that you bring up about God providing, the word also says faith without works, without work. I alluded to in the beginning of the conversation that the Black church is a microcosm of the community. Most churches, even the large mega churches with means, there's only a handful of people in there that are tithing on the regular, that are working on the regular. And for everyone that says churches should open up their doors on cold days and do things, I was a member of a church that I'm very proud, Parkland Assembly of God, that worked a lot. Of the 1,500 members at that church, the pastor wanted to do things outside the walls. And on a cold Thanksgiving one year, we opened up the doors to feed the homeless and shelter the homeless. Nobody showed up. No one showed up. And then on another Sunday, he challenged us to get out in the community. 1,500 members. When he gave that challenge and said we're gonna have church outside the doors, of about 1,500 people, maybe 60 stuck around. So I stand by that the church is a microcosm. I want to go to the questions in the group. There's some Anthony Sims asked this question. He said, and this goes back to defining the role of the Black church. He said, should the Black churches start to set up credit unions for the communities and church members? And alluding to Ivo's point, Black churches already do that, but
Absolutely.
Brother George, I want your input on this specifically because I appreciate your point that you said that when you lead with the color, you're going to immediately get pushback. And I actually agree with that. And one of my biggest issues in the church politically is that a lot of churches lead with a party. And that drives me insane. God did not wear a red or a blue shirt. He was nonpartisan. And as a Christian, as a Black Christian, it drives me insane. But I want to let you lead in with Brother Sims' question.
Yeah, that's a very appropriate question because it ties in with the question that you asked, Penny, before my screen went out, which is, should the Black church serve a moral role or an economic role? And my comeback to that is, why should we separate the morality from the economics when
there you go?
They're both hand in hand.
Yes.
And then just on a side note, the discussion that we just witnessed between Daniel and Ivo is another identifier of the ineffectiveness of our ideology, because both Daniel and Ivo are making solid points. Here's the thing. When we're in this race ideology, it sounds like we're talking different, because one of the primary goals of race is to separate the Black male from the Black female. And we can never connect because we've had generations of tension between us, because both sides feel that their needs have not been met emotionally and physically, generationally. And so I know it sounds crazy, it sounds like totally unrelated, but I just want to keep in mind for everybody that when we talk about this, the minute we start taking up strong stances against each other and it sounds like we're debating each other, we're playing into our competition's hands instead of looking for where the accuracy is on all sides. All the panelists here have some contribution into the solution of how we can move our spiritual resource in a more effective fashion. So when it comes to the credit union issue, anything that we can do to economically empower us is what we need to do. Here's the thing, however, we're dealing with a set of beliefs that sabotage us whenever we talk about economically joining forces, because people take roles and people take distrust, and it's their ice is colder philosophy, or if there's money, then people want to find themselves in positions to be in control of that money. We're doing it to ourselves. And so we're taking on an ideology, trying to be like what we see them doing. And when we try to do it, we just don't do it as well. We're intelligent enough, we understand the game, but when we're playing outside of our strengths, we can only do what they're doing half as well. Because they created the game, we did not. We just got let in the game. They are generations ahead of us economically. Just like on the issue of gentrification, like we talked a few shows back. Those, the gentrification issues, those are made way before we see it. These are 25, 30-year plans. They already know the neighborhoods that they're moving towards. So by the time it comes to us, we're again behind the 8 ball. And we're behind the 8 ball because everything we do is in reaction to. So when you look at the when you look at the quote unquote black church, the black church is not at the forefront cutting the new path. The black church is still responding, asking other communities that we perceive have the influence and power, will you make this happen for us? And as long as we stay in that mindset, which is the mindset of race ideology, we will never get out there and move ahead. A black man will never outrun a white man, no matter how well look at President Obama, right? The most powerful man in the world, and at that time. And now we have another presidency that's reversing everything that he set out to do. Now, if that doesn't tell you the ineffectiveness of race ideology in terms of the role we're playing, nothing will. And so again, I know it sounds like it's totally unrelated, but our first issue is our identity. Because it's our identity that makes us, instead of listen to each other and find the areas that we can resonate on to move forward, we spend more energy in tension with each other and can never move forward because we paralyze our own efforts.
I would like to agree with most of what you said, 90% of it, 95% of it. I do agree. I think, to be really totally honest, and this might be a very difficult pill for our religious brothers and sisters to digest. I think the basis and foundation of what George is saying is that if you really want to go to the core of it, none of this is ours. Yes, I ain't gonna cuss. None of this is ours. This religion ain't ours. Let me finish. Listen. You gotta have a time.
Let me help you. Let me
finish. Let him finish.
Let me finish what I'm saying. Listen.
Let him finish.
Listen. This is what I'm saying. If you know our history, and I know it's very emotional, because if you know your history, you know our story, this is not ours. This is not ours. These clothes I'm wearing didn't come from us. This phone in my hand, the laws we follow, the way we raise our children, the textbooks, you can go on and on, is not fundamentally us. It's very difficult to do that because it's a fundamental foundation of what we have been programmed to believe is us. It is not us, though. We have yet, as a people, to do simple things. And I implore you to please listen to or read Chancellor Williams' book, The Destruction of Black Civilization from 4500 AD to 2000, before that, 4500 BC to 2000 AD. it's been a systemic destruction of our genetic ancestry line for over 6,000 years. You have to start there. Once you start there, you will begin to see, okay, this is
Christianity absolutely belongs to us. It was stolen from us.
You cut me off. Listen,
about American society and economics, I agree with that.
Hear me out.
Christianity is absolutely ours.
Hear me out. You cut me off. I'm very quiet, very quietly, very much for a long time. I like to digest everything. And I know this is a very emotional and a very difficult thing for a lot of us to acknowledge. Because we've been conditioned about our lives. We've been conditioned that our lips are ugly, that our skin is bad, and our hair is bad, and all these other negative things about us is all bull crap. So what I'm telling you is, in order for us to truly be liberated, like George is saying, we have to begin from the core. Because the reality is we are results of trauma. 400 years of trauma. Psychological trauma, mental trauma, physical trauma, cultural trauma. So until we begin to say, you know what, I'm going to establish my own definition of what feminine is, what is feminism, what is masculinity, what is raising children, what is marriage. We have to have everything we've done is a carbon copy of our precious ways of doing things.
But that's
with a little bit of remnants of of what was left over. So that means it's not really ours. And it's a very difficult thing to say, you know what I'm using right now is not, first of all, it's not working for me. That's one fact. And the second thing is it doesn't belong to me. You cannot, like Malcolm said, what was it, Malcolm? Or was it John Henry Clark? You can't take your oppressor's way of doing things and expect to be free. That's insane. It's insanity. So we have to actually begin to investigate what was our indigenous ways of doing things. We actually were the builders of the world before the white man was even thought of. So we have to go back and say, what were we most, to me as a science person, where were we most successful? At what time of our history were we most successful? Did we have boats? Did we have land? Did we have peace? Did we have happiness? You start from there. And that is your foundation of greatness. It's not going to be an easy process, but that is where we should begin. And
Honey, I need you to start with the we thing. First of all, I agree with a lot of what you said, but the we need to and the nothing is ours, that's not a true statement. It's too broad. You're painting with too broad a brush. Number one, Christianity absolutely is ours. It was stolen from us, repackaged, and then given back to a people whose history had been taken from them. But I am one of those Black Christians who is aware that we are genetically the descendants of the Hebrew people. That was our religion. Christianity belongs to me, and I don't practice the white man's version. I'm not a Trinitarian because I know that I have to go back to my origins. I don't raise my children the way the white man taught me to. I'm all about going back to the origins, but to say that Christianity does not belong to us is simply an untrue statement.
I have a question.
Yes.
Did you hear him say that Christianity doesn't belong to us, or did you hear him? He didn't say that.
It's not our religion.
No, he didn't say that.
That's what I heard.
I'm not trying to speak for him, but I'm not trying to speak for him, and he can correct me after I say it. But here's what I heard. He's talking about the substance of what we do, the way that we decided to do it is not ours. He didn't say a particular religion or form of belief isn't ours. So again, the way I hear it, and he's going to correct me after I finish, but I hear you and him saying the exact same thing. But you're interpreting him to say that Christianity is not ours, and he's not saying that. I don't believe it.
Well, if that's not what you're saying, then that's great. But at the very beginning of what you were saying, I thought I heard you say Christianity is not our religion.
It isn't.
Huh?
I will go on without having being interpreted, Christianity is not our religion. And if we are not following the Abyssinian Christian, the Ethiopian Abyssinian version of Christianity, anything else that we're following is counterfeit. I will say that.
Then Daniel, you're saying the exact same thing. We're all saying the same thing.
We're saying different things.
I want to wait, Karaji. I want to know what you have. You haven't affirmed or denied.
I'm letting y'all talk. I won't respond. I sit back and listen.
But I want you to answer that question. Did you not say that Christianity was not our religion in the beginning?
What I'm saying is to say that, okay, well, if you study the true core of Christianity, it comes from Kemet. First of all, it's Kemetic, because if you don't turn your head, you gotta listen. We gotta be open to it.
I know what you're talking about. I just haven't been of that information, but I do know what you're talking about.
Okay, so if you listen to the story of Osiris and Isis, that is the core of the virgin birth.
No, sir, it is not. That is one of many civilization, ancient prophecies of Jesus Christ.
You cut me off. I didn't cut you off.
The origin of the Christ story. The prophecy of Jesus Christ has been shown since the beginning.
You cut me off. We got to respect your.
We're not going here right now because this is not relevant to the main.
I was just saying, I don't want to. We've gotten so.
I want to finish what I'm saying. So I want to finish what I'm saying.
DM me. Because we can talk about it.
We've gotten deep into the woods. We've gotten way too deep into the woods.
Ask me a question. Answer from my perspective.
But it's not, we're getting off of the main point.
Right. My whole point is, let me finish. I didn't finish what I was saying. So,
but you're getting off the main point.
Yeah. Not really, because you asked me a question, answer from my perspective.
Listen, the question I asked you was a yes or no question. I don't want to get into this theological debate about the origins of Christianity. That's getting way off the subject. It was a yes or no question. Did you say yes or no, Christianity is black? Yes or no?
Yes or no what? Christianity is what?
Is Christianity our religion? I wanted you to answer that question.
When I say it's our, okay, let me answer that.
I don't want to get into the detail.
You can't limit, I'm not going to limit you to yes or no, because that's like saying,
for the purpose of the time, Karaji, for the purpose of the time, the relevance to the conversation, for the purpose of the time and relevance of the conversation, you have to answer the question yes or no.
Okay,
I don't have time to dig into that.
It's not a yes or no answer. It's a
hey, Penny.
Yes, sir.
Penny. I'm listening in an objective fashion because I'm a true believer that everybody here is bringing truth to this conversation. And what I'm hearing, there's no separation from what anybody's saying here. It's the separation is in the tone and demeanor, but everybody is on the same page here. We're just arguing a tomato discussion. And a conversation has to be a forward-moving discussion. We cannot make it contingent that we all see things the exact same way. We have to honor each other's points of view in moving this ball forward. And I want to again say that anytime we find ourselves paralyzed in discussion, that is to the advantage of our competitor. And we need to stop that. We cannot force people to see things 100% our way. It has to be an organic process where I take a little bit of what you got, what she has, what he has, and how does it work for our community? This is where we always happen. It always happens when, and I'm not saying specific to us, but we see this pattern happen a lot when we start talking about issues of the Black community, whether it's the church, economic, sports, or whatever. We all, instead of coming from a collective standards of identity, we're coming with our individual experiences and perspectives and demanding that each other see it the way we see it. And that's a recipe for failure. Not that anybody is wrong, because nobody's wrong here, but the conversation has clearly taken a halt because we're talking about things that aren't as specifically important. You know, everybody here's got truth from their experiences, and we need to honor that so we can move forward. And again, at risk of sounding redundant, this is a result because the panelists here are trauma. I'm traumatized. I'm working through my trauma. We all have issues of trauma, okay? And so we've got to recognize that. I can't come to you as an expert because I'm messed up too. So the only way that we're going to move forward is to respect each other's issues and say, okay, I feel you, brother, I feel you, sister. Now, how do we move forward? And the thing that I want to pound into this discussion is, as long as we frame this in a paradigm of color, we will never move forward. We're just mixing the stew around.
I do want to just touch on that, just because I think that
You better not be touching on that. This argument about Kemet and no, don't do that. Don't do that.
No. No, that's totally different. See, I didn't want to get into theology. I really wanted to deal with specific community. But I do want to touch on what George said, just because I understand the thought process that you're saying when you say every time we speak from an identity of color. But I do want to point out that we didn't make the rules of how our skin dictates how we're treated by dominant society. Even if we identified as African, even if we identified as indigenous people, the color of our skin still dictates, regardless of how we identify, still dictates.
Now stop right there. Now stop right there, because that's a really solid point. I'm glad you said that. Now here's the thing. You heard that cliche, it ain't what they call you, but what?
What you answer to.
What you answer to. So, you have these discussions a lot of times where those that are well-to-do will say, well, look at those blacks that come from Haiti or from Nigeria or from somewhere else, and look how well they're doing. Why can't you guys get your own stuff together? That's because those that come outside of America have had full experience with their own cultural origins.
I agree.
So that when they get here, when I'm doing my workshops on this topic, the authentic Africans that attend my workshops, a lot of them will say, I didn't know I was black till I came to America.
Absolutely.
Okay? But here's the thing. They are more prepared to deal with the race ideology because they don't internalize that. They know who they really are.
The original culture.
They know who they are. They've been inflicted with trauma. They've been assaulted, but they've always had direct connection with their Yoruba, with their Ijaw, with their Xhosa. They know who they are. And so they're prepared to come to America and take full advantage of what they offer here, because their mind is not in the race paradigm. They are objective onlookers, can see when someone's approaching them from a racial perspective, and they can parlay that and use strategies to counter that and move forward. Whereas American blacks, so to speak, we've been generationally saturated with that. So when we do get called the N-word, when we do get discriminated, we take it so personal because it affects us at our very core. So I'm challenging us to say, let's dissociate ourselves from color. I'm not saying let's ignore color. I'm not telling you even what to be. What I'm asking you to consider is, can you dissociate who you are from race? Because you're not a skin color. You're much more than a skin color. And when you do that, it allows you to take a more objective look at your circumstances. And when you're objective, that takes the emotion out of the game, and you can respond rather than react, because there's a difference, right? You can respond. You can consciously choose, okay, this person is coming at me this way, and I know they're trying to get this reaction. So here's how I'm going to counter that, because at the end of this situation, I need to be 7 steps down the Monopoly board.
I would counter some of that. Some of what you're saying is very true. But historically, even if we go to the ancients, lighter people, the Arabs, historically, the Caucasians, they knew the power of black people. Even in Africa, they knew our power, because for over 50,000 years we ran the world, and our color is not something that is to be taken lightly. Melanin is extremely powerful. It's not, oh, this melanin thing, you could be white and had to say, no. Melanin, this dark skin I got from my daddy, is the real thing. So we want to be careful. I understand what your point is. We don't want our color to be the only thing that defines us, but we don't want to also marginalize it.
No, I agree.
So it's a very, very fine line between not making it the main thing and also making sure that we recognize that it's still beautiful and it's still relevant for who we are ancestrally. Right. So I understand your point.
If you're finished, Karanji, I'd like to make a point going in a different direction about the efficacy of the Black church, how it's a microcosm of the Black community, like Penny has been reminding us. And one thing that's particularly important, and it came out in this debate, we don't respect each other's intellect because culturally, intellectualism isn't really
sexy.
Being devoted to education in all things. I'm one of those preachers that I've been told I'm a preacher's preacher because I'm so cerebral and I take a clinical approach to things because that's just who I am. But that's not common because we have a lot of emotionalism in our culture. Of course, it bleeds over into the Black church. And so those of us who are not members of the church, but who do believe in study and intellectualism often come to members of the Black church with assumptions about what we don't know. People tell me all kinds of stuff. That's my first exposure because most Black Christians, unfortunately, are uninformed or are led to believe that any information outside of Christian doctrine is harmful or damaging, so leave it alone. But that's not true for everybody. It's a bit stereotypical, and we're all growing and evolving. So if we look at the Black church as a microcosm of the Black community, then I think we can be more fair in our approach to discussing intellectual, spiritual, and religious issues. We tend to assume that Christians are ignorant, and many times, unfortunately, they are. But the assumption is also damaging because when you have well-informed Christians who can hold these conversations, they often turn into arguments early on because of the way we approach each other. And so touching on what George was talking about, we as a community lack respect for each other across the board. And this comes out when we have issues with the Black church because Black people don't respect Black people. We don't respect institutions. And much to George's point, it's because Black is often the primary identifier or qualifier. So we need to respect each other more just in general, myself included, but we have a lot of hostility toward each other, and there's a lot of hostility toward the Black church from Black people, both former members and non-Christians alike, and it's really unfair to expect to have real conversations about the efficacy of the Black church when we come into the conversation with hostility already in place.
I do want to touch really quick. I do want to say that I understand your perspective. I honor it. But I think that for a lot of us who have left the church, we don't leave unless you have had a bad experience. I think we just leave the church because we want to do more for our community. Speaking for people like myself and a lot of people such as myself who have said, look, I'll be the first to say, I'm the day that somebody from the church wants to do something with me for the benefit of the community, I'm the first person to say, let's get to work. You know, so I think that there has to be an understanding of the fact that those of us who leave the church don't necessarily leave the church because there is a animosity to the church. Sometimes it is part of our own growth. Sometimes there is a path that we take that separates us from that particular path. Doesn't mean that I'm against working with the church. Doesn't mean that I have any animosity to the church. Just means that I want to do more for my people or my community outside of the confines of what specific churches are able to do.
I think he brings a good point up too, that I think the church has to be, okay, people should respect the church, but also the church is to respect other people. Like, so there are people who practice, for example, African traditional spiritual belief systems. or some of us practice Islam, or whatever spiritual Buddhism. I think for us to truly progress, the church, people in the church need to not disinclude those people because they are doing things maybe differently. And I said you guys are like that, but you guys, I'm sure everybody in this panel can agree that people who are Christian can always say, "Oh, that's some old devil worshiping stuff you had." You know what I'm saying? You going to hell? They automatically damn that person. You know what I'm saying? And that is totally wrong. You know what I'm saying? So
the Christian belief system does dictate that if you
right,
there's
which is
only one path. But I
right.
agree that
We go progressive people.
Black people are not all Christians.
We have no tolerance, right? We gotta have tolerance.
Yeah, I agree. I agree.
If we have no tolerance, we're not gonna progress. Because there's a huge chunk of people that aren't Christians. That's the reality. Who can help us progress as a people. So once we begin to say, my personal relationship with my spirituality has nothing to do with yours. I know that you're a good person and I'm a good person and we can work together. That's all that matters. That needs to be the main forefront. And I think that's why sometimes people unify around blackness first over them saying, okay, I'm black. You and me, we're all four, we black first. And that's where the issue comes up sometimes, George, is that, we have to find another common ground, but right now that's the common ground. That even this thing called black space, that Nate got us all talking in, it brought us together. So it still is overall a positive outcome. We may have had disagreements, but it's still overall positive outcome that we came together and we're gonna take our things we learned and take it to our community, to our families, and to our people in our respective cities. So, I think we have to begin, like she said, to begin to respect each other's differences and look at the big picture. The reality is our people, our ancestral line, whatever you want to call us, we got a lot of work to do. And we need to be honest and critical and critiquing on everything that has power in our community. We got to critique the schools, we got to critique the churches, we got to critique the banks, critique everything. Everything needs
every
to
institution.
have, everything needs to have,
and intelligently.
everything needs to have an audit, all of it.
Knowledgeably and intelligently. Yes.
I will say this.
If we can't do that,
Oh.
to me, Blas, if you're above being quote unquote audited or being critiqued, then you need to go somewhere else because you're not really part of the solution. Because we're all the victims of trauma, and
Yes.
our institutions are victims of trauma as well. So our institutions say, okay, how can we fix this trauma so we can make our people better? Period.
Amen.
And we got to leave it there. This has been a great conversation, but I want to get my last 2 cents in. I'm not penny for no reason.
You're a penny.
This is going to be a great conversation piece offline. And I alluded to this in the beginning when I said, what role do we want the Black church to play? Do we want the Black church to play a moral role or an economic one? And to Brother Daniel's point, everyone has their reason for leaving the church. Some is for inactivity, and I pointed to earlier, you can find churches that do a lot of activity in the community. Some people leave because the church came down, Ivo, I'm sure you've heard this expression, the pastor came down my block with, he was talking about, I'm a fornicator, he's talking about fornication. I don't necessarily like that, so I'm gonna leave. A lot of these people leave the church scorned because the church wasn't meeting their specific needs, but you have to ask yourself the question, what role do you want the church to have? And that's something that, I want you guys to think about offline once we get there, then we can have a broader conversation. If you want the church to have a financial impact on the community, then let's have that conversation. If you want it to have a moral impact on the community, that, in my opinion, is a whole different conversation as well, because you have to approach it differently. And so we're going to leave it there. Listen, I want to thank you guys for a very good discussion. Ivo, I love that you came in. I really appreciate you.
Yeah.
Your knowledge is immense, and you are an amazing individual. Brother Karanji, we have got to talk and continue and stay in touch. I love brothers that are intelligent and strong in thought. I love it. I'm not one of those quote unquote Christians that believe everybody going to hell. And then Brother Daniel as well. I appreciate you guys bringing your knowledge and expertise This has been another great episode of Black Space Live. I thank you guys and tune in Tuesday. Same black time. Same black time.
Tuesday.
Same black space. That's nice.
All power to the people.
All right, you guys. Good night.
Peace and love, man. Peace and love.
Black Space, a safe space for our community.